Hey, y'all. So today we're going to focus on probably one of, I would say, the more complex topics in this unit on cities, and that is urban models. So I'm only focusing on one topic today because I'm going to kind of throw a lot at you, and I want to make sure that we are able to understand each one of these models. So, one thing it's important to understand about talking about models is that not every single model fits every single city. Okay, so for example, we're going to be talking about urban models in North America versus urban models in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. So not all cities fit perfectly into each one of these models. It's also important to understand that these models have changed over time. When they were originally created, a lot of times it was decades ago. So some of these cities that they were originally modeled after have changed. But we're going to go over a brief outline of each one of these models and kind of look at some of the distinguishing characteristics and how that model depicts that particular city. All right, so to start off with, I think this one is the easiest to understand. This is entitled the concentric zone model, and it was created by a geographer named Burgess. Mr. Burgess modeled the concentric zone model after urban Chicago. And one of the key features of the concentric zone model that makes it easy to understand is this series of rings, what's called concentric rings. Basically, these rings have developed around what's in the center. And in the center is a term very important to urban geography, and that's the central business district. A lot of time that could be a downtown area or an uptown area of a city. And according to Burgess, cities have grown around the central business district in a series of rings. Okay, so if we're thinking about like a central business district, think of downtown Charlotte. Think of Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte. Think of Time Warner Cable Arena in Charlotte. The Epicenter, which has movie theaters and nightclubs and restaurants. That is kind of the downtown area of Charlotte. And if Charlotte were to follow the concentric zone model, then basically growth would have occurred outside of the city of Charlotte in a series of surrounding rings. So we've got that central business district here in the center. And then on the outside of that, we have what's called a zone of transition. And these are people that, can't afford to necessarily live in the heart of the central business district because the rent is too high. But you can see that a lot of times it could be sort of some multiple level houses, maybe townhomes, small apartments, that kind of stuff. Zone 3 is what's called the independent workers' homes. So this is this little kind of peachy colored that we see here. Yet again, these, if you look at the density of the housing, it is definitely more dense than, say, the suburb areas that are in the outskirts of the city here, but still pretty close together. These people are able to still, work and play in the side of the central business district. All right, zone 4. If we move out to this darker shade of green on the outside, this is called the zone of better residences. Basically, these are people who are living in more affluent homes, who live in larger areas, and who wanted to have a little bit more space. So they're not going to be right on top of each other. And then zone 5 is what's called the commuter's zone. These are people who are going to commute to work inside of the central business district, but simply just don't want to live there because it's either crowded or they can't afford it. And they want to have these homes that are further apart, spread apart from each other. So when we think about the concentric zone model, the most important thing to understand is that a series of rings that have grown around the central business district. All right. The next model is the Hoyt sector model. So anytime you see the word sector or wedge, that is a key identifying factor from the Hoyt sector model. And so if you'll notice in the model here, it's not a series of rings anymore. According to Homer Hoyt, who is the geographer who invented this model, cities have grown apart in a series of sectors. They have an area of outgrowth from the central business district in a series of wedge. So a great example of that is that once we see an area of high class housing, so high income housing. So in this case, it's this spine, okay? High income housing. Then most of the time that high income housing is built further out from the center. Instead of coming around in a ring, it just kind of starts to extend out. So we can see that high residential housing this way. Another example of that, we see low-class residential areas. Okay, these low-class residential areas, instead of coming from in rings like in the Burgess model, they are in a series of wedges. Okay, so we've got the low class wedge here. Then we've got middle class residential in these areas right here. Okay, which are in sectors or wedges, and then an area of what's called transportation and industry. So instead of coming in rings, it's going out in a series of wedges and sectors. Yet the same thing that's very similar is that the central business district is at the center of the city. It's kind of the starting point for where things grow out of. All right, our next urban model is what's called the Harris-Ullman multiple nuclei model. When I think of this, I think of the word nucleus, and that kind of throwing that back to science. A nucleus, of course, is kind of the center of all activity in a cell. So very similar to how the nucleus in a city, according to this model, that a city can have more than one center where activities revolve. In this model, there's not just one thing that things grow out of. Now, there's still a central business district, and we can see in that map that there's still going to be an area of skyscrapers and economic activity, but there's other centers in the city where activity grows around. So, for example, we have an area of what's called wholesale light manufacturing. So this light manufacturing can be considered its own little nucleus, okay? An outlying business district, this area right here can be its own nucleus where growth has come out of. We have residential suburbs that can be their own nucleus. Medium-class residential areas that are their own nucleus. So a couple of great examples, just to put this in a real-world scenario, how this applies to real-world life. Think about a city that has a university in the middle of it. Well, what kind of activities are universities or colleges going to attract? Well, most of the time it's going to be well-educated people who are going to be affiliated with that. A lot of pizzerias. I mean, college kids love to eat pizza. Bookstores, bars, nightclubs. Those are the kinds of activities that are going to be attracted towards a university nucleus. An airport can also be an example of a nucleus of a city where settlement or growth has been surrounded by that area. So if you think about an airport, a lot of times on the outskirts or near an airport, you're going to find a lot of hotels, places for people to stay. You're going to find a lot of warehouses where a lot of trade or objects are traded and travel is brought on by the airport being there. So the multiple nuclei model is just where there's a lot of different centers of activity, and those activities revolve around that particular nucleus, and it doesn't always have to be the central business district. Okay, the galactic city model. One of the things that is easy to understand or kind of a big identifying factor about the galactic city model is this edge around the city. It's called the beltway, okay? We might think of this as maybe like a freeway or an interstate. And on the edge of these galactic city model, we have what's called edge cities. We're going to talk about edge cities a little bit more in just a little bit. But edge cities, how I like to think of them, is kind of like suburban neighborhoods. Areas where you might find a large shopping mall, or you might find a lot of economic activity that just simply might not be in the central business district. A great example of that, if you've ever traveled on 485 in Charlotte, you know that there's a huge outlet mall on 485. Well, why can't there be an outlet mall in the central business district? Well, the closer you get to the center of the city, the more expensive the land is. Okay, but if you build your outlet mall near the suburbs, those are going to be the people that are going to be shopping at your area anyway. Okay, so the galactic city model typically has an inner city that can be the central business district, and also that can be areas of either low-income housing or very high-income housing, depending on what city it is. But it is surrounded on this beltway, large suburban residential and business areas. That's what each of these little settlements right here represents. Some kind of residential or business area. Okay, these are also considered to be the nodes of business services and consumer services. So think back to that large shopping mall that I talked about. The suburbs, okay, these areas outside of the city, they're going to maybe want to go to the mall here. Maybe they're going to want to go to this business park on the outside. Or maybe they want to go to the airport complex that's over here. Maybe they want to go to the employment and shopping center. Or maybe they want to go to the service center that is just here. So the galactic city model just kind of connects all of these places with this large beltway or freeway with the different suburbs of the city. And the key thing to understand about galactic city model is it includes edge cities, those suburban, residential, and economic areas. Okay, I did not put this one on your note sheet, very detailed, because we have already gone over the bid rent theory when we talked about agriculture. The bid rent theory, just going to review it because it can also apply to city situations. The further away you are from the center of the city, typically the cheaper the land. Okay, so the closer you get to the center of the city, the more expensive the land. No surprise then that a lot of people that live in Charlotte or work in Charlotte don't necessarily live in the downtown area simply because they can't afford it. Okay, so the bid rent theory also helps to explain why things like shops and offices can afford the bid for the higher rents in the center city. High-priced lawyers may have a law office downtown because it's close to where they need to go to the courthouse, but they also can afford those kinds of things. So if we look at the bid rent curve, okay, the thing that typically is further apart from the city is single houses. A single family is less likely to be able to afford something super close to the central business district, which is typically why we see a lot of single family homes further away from the city. Apartments, although they may not be all the time right in the middle of the center of the city, people can afford to live in apartments cheaper than they can to have a single family home closer to the city. Retail, you're going to see a lot of shops being in the central business district or closer to the city because those retailers can afford the rent to pay for those things. It's not like a housing rent. It's more of a rent I have to be located here to get people to come shop. So that's the bid rent theory applied to cities. Okay, so for the next couple of models, we're going to focus on models that are not in the developed areas necessarily. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. These are not modeled on American cities. Obviously, these are also not modeled on European cities. So they're going to be very distinct. Okay, but yet again, they don't always follow, every single Latin American city doesn't always follow this perfectly, but this is just a generic thing. So the key word here to always remember about Latin American city models is they have what's called this elite residential spine. So when I hear the word spine, I kind of think of backbone. And if we look at this model here, this prestigious spine includes areas of commercial businesses, but it can also include maybe a landmark of the city. Maybe a famous church is located on the commercial spine. Maybe the richest people live in this commercial spine. Okay. Also very determinant of a Latin American city model is what's called squatter settlements. We're going to talk about those a little bit later. Squatter settlements is another word for shanty town or another word for slum. So these squatter settlements are typically made when people are attracted to come to the city for things like jobs and economic opportunity, but there's just simply not a lot of affordable housing for those people to live there. So they construct these settlements out of whatever they can find, whether it be cardboard, tin, paper, whatever it may be, to try to find or create a house in these areas. So typically, if you were to go into the slums of a city in Latin America, it's not going to be a very pleasant place to be. Okay. In addition to the central business district being in the center of the city, on the other side of the central business district is a market. Okay. And typically that market is been an area that's been around for a very long time, and it's a traditional area for selling goods. A lot of times in Latin American city models, we see, there being a really important market where people trade for food and items and whatever. So that elite residential spine, those squatter settlements, and then the market along from the central business district is very typical of Latin American cities. All right. So Sub-Saharan African city models, we typically see three central business districts in the middle of those models there. Okay. One of them is the remnant of an old colonial central business district. And if we remember anything from about during the age of colonization, pretty much every single year or every single African city or settlement or place was conquered and controlled by European powers after the Berlin Conference. And as a result of that, European colonial powers have left their impact on a lot of African cities. So one of the central business districts there is typically the remnant of an old colonial central business district. We also see a periodic market zone. Now, what does periodic mean? It means it's there fluently, not always open all the time. So we see some sub-Saharan African markets that are open daily, but we see some that are only open seasonally. So that's that market zone. And then what we see also is just a traditional central business district. So a modern version of a central business district in a sub-Saharan African area. Okay. Typically, we have either neighborhoods surrounding the three CBDs as well as manufacturing zones or mining zones. And then on the outskirts of the town, we have what's called satellite townships. Okay, these are residential areas for people who are moving into the cities. All right, so our last model is the Southeast Asian city model. And as you can see, it's very, very different from the other models that we have taken a look at. The focus of the Southeast Asian city is what's called a colonial port zone. A lot of these Southeast Asian cities are located on water. A port, of course, is an area where ship traffic and trade is brought into the city. A lot of times this is very similar to the commercial uses that we see in North America and Europe. Ports, of course, help to facilitate trade. Extending out from those port zones it could be possibly government zones, which is what we see on the right-hand side of this model, or commercial zones. And then we have what's called a belt of market gardening. Okay, market gardening that surrounds and supplies. So market gardening is another word for truck farming. So those people that are doing the fruits and vegetables and stuff, trying to provide food for the city, are going to be kind of on this belt outside. Now, right here, we see zones of suburbs and squatter areas. Now, these squatter areas are what we see here with the letter A. Those are the shanty towns, the slums, and then the suburbs are kind of the more the middle class area. So definitely a different model here for a lot of Southeast Asian cities. I know this is a little confusing, especially since we aren't together and able to kind of go over this together. But you do have a urban model assignment on Google Classroom. It's a virtual model assignment. So each one of the links that's on your Google Classroom will take you to more of an article that will help you to understand kind of the key characteristics of each of those models. So go back through, make sure you can differentiate between these models because they all could potentially pop up on the AP exam. Please let me know if you have any questions.